If you're like me, you probably first ran into port when you were trying to find, a wine that would be sweet and be very high in alcohol. And port is both of those things, but it is also so much more. Now, port is a fortified wine produced exclusively in the Douro Valley in northern Portugal. And it's characterized by its sweetness and distinctive flavor profile, which is achieved by, of course, adding grape spirit to it, hence the fortification during its fermentation, which halts the fermentation process and leaves this wonderful residual sugar in the wine. Now, this gives us two things. It gives us, yes, high alcohol content, but it also gives us this beautiful, sweet, and elegant taste. Now, of course, they've been making port in the Douro Valley for a really, really long time, but its popularity began in the 17th century when British merchants facing trade embargoes with France sought alternative sources for their wine. Now, they turned to the Douro Valley in northern Portugal, where the challenging terrain and unique environment created these incredible, robust wines. However, these wines were also a little too fragile to make it back on the long sea voyage to England. So to preserve the wine, merchants began adding a small amount of brandy to the wine during fermentation. And this fortification halted the process of fermentation, preserving the sweetness and adding a layer of complexity. Now, this accidental innovation gave birth to port wine as we know it today. Now, the addition of brandy or eau de vie to port is not necessarily something within fortified wines which is quite special, but it is when we're using aged brandy. Now, this process not only increases the alcohol content, but it also preserves sweetness and adds complexity to the flavor from that age, which is there in the brandy. Now, of course, port is a product of a specific terroir. It's the Douro Valley. Now, this unique climate, soil, and grape varieties contribute to its really distinct character. Now, all port is primarily made from a blend of indigenous Portuguese grape varieties such as Touriga Nacional, Touriga Franca, and Tinta Barroca, which give the wine silky tannins, excellent body, and this huge amount of fruit, which we can see throughout both aging and fortification. The grape growing within the Douro Valley is actually terraced on the sides of these incredible mountains, which produces these very, very different striations of terroir as we look through the vineyard. So in order to make port, the grapes are typically hand harvested, and that's simply because those terraces are incredibly steep. Once they're harvested, those grapes are crushed and fermented, but the process is halted before all of the sugar is converted to alcohol. That process is stopped by, of course, brandy. That addition of brandy will usually increase the alcohol content to around 20%. Then port is aged in oak barrels or sometimes just aged in the bottle, depending on the style. Now, there are a few different styles of port. The most common is going to be ruby port, which is known for its vibrant red color and fruity flavors. And ruby port is typically aged in larger oak vats rather than small casks. Then we, of course, have tawny port. And tawny port develops a nutty caramel-like flavor and a golden brown color, and the longer it ages, the deeper the color and the more complex the flavors actually become. Then we have the next step, and that's vintage port. Now, that's usually made from a single exceptional vintage. One harvest which is absolutely stunning. It may be aged in bottle for many years, it may be aged in casks for many years, and that will allow it to develop this incredibly rich and very singular style of flavor. Then we have white port, which is typically made with white wine, but made in the same way. Through the crushing and then the arrested fermentation, early within the winemaking process, which creates this really bright and fresh aperitif style of sweet wine. Now, of course, something this good isn't just going to be owned by the Portuguese. While port primarily utilizes its indigenous varietals, we then have New World port or New World tawny. Australian tawny offers a unique interpretation of this fortified wine style, drawing on the inspiration of traditional port whilst incorporating the distinct characteristics of both Australian winemaking and also Australia's terroir. Now, there are a whole bunch of brands that you would already know from port production. Taylor's is one of the biggest ones, with all of its vintage ports having worldwide success. There's then Graham's, Cockburn's, Nyport. These are all family producers that are renowned for their robust and full-bodied vintage ports. The really cool thing is that just like Scotch whiskey, there are actually quite a few families which blend different ports together in order to make their signature house style. However, the more you dig, the more you're going to find interesting, intricate, single vineyard ports, single vineyard, tawnies, which are really going to stretch the imagination of what port can be. Now, when you're drinking port, well, it's typically served at room temperature, depending on the style. However, it can be enjoyed chilled if you're maybe drinking white port. Now, I'd obviously recommend that you just enjoy it straight up, but also I would recommend that you use it as a food pairing, because it's awesome with creme brulee, it's awesome with nuts, maybe chocolate and other desserts like sticky date pudding. Pour it on your ice cream, and these are all great ways that you can enjoy port more. Or if you're not in the mood for any of that, you can of course mix port into fantastic cocktails, and there's a great cocktail called a continental sour, which we have linked below in the description of the video if you want to learn how to make it at home. The main thing is enjoy port, get into it, and if you don't like it, that's okay too.